Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the Adapting to Sea Level Rise, Climate Adaptation, and Land Preservation for Salt Marsh Ecosystem sessions. We have 4 presentations to share with you today. And our first presentation will be from Adrienne Pappal, who is the Coastal Habitat and Water Quality Manager for the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm excited to be here today to talk about CZM's salt marsh work and more specifically on salt marsh resiliency. Next slide, please. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about salt marshes. They occupy the narrow fringe between land and sea and provide a really critical habitat for a wide variety of species. They also provide critical services such as for water quality, storm buffering, flood storage, and carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. Within the marsh itself is a mosaic of grasses that are specifically adapted to tidal conditions. So places that are only flooded by the highest tides are what we call high marsh. Next slide, please. To those areas that are flooded more regularly, or what we call low marsh. And there's places in between. Next slide, please. Within the marsh itself, there's areas that remain wet all the time, such as pans, pools, and depressions. Next slide. An important factor in understanding how marshes form and maintain is the interaction between sediments and the plants and soils, which they interact together to build elevation both vertically and horizontally. And this is a really important factor to consider for salt marsh resiliency, particularly as sea levels are rising. Next slide, please. Massachusetts has a wide distribution of salt marshes across our coasts. We have about 45,000 acres of marsh, give or take. Next slide, please. And depending on where you are in the state, the conditions can be very different. So in the Acadian province, which is part of the Gulf of Maine, north of the Cape, you can see tidal ranges that are 2 to 3 times higher than what you might see south of the Cape in the Virginian province. Next slide, please. Humans have had a long history of interaction with marshes for farming and for other practices. Next slide, please. As we can see here in this overview of the marshes behind Salisbury Beach, we can see linear features that have been dug in the marsh. These are ditches to drain the marsh surface, either for mosquito control or farming. These interfere with the natural hydrology of the marsh and can also lead to areas of lower elevation or subsidence. Next slide. We also have a heavily developed coast, as in other places, and the surrounding land use and factors within the buffer can also contribute to conditions within the marsh. Next slide, please. With sea level rise and climate change, there's an ever-growing concern to better understand marsh resiliency and to identify marshes which may be vulnerable. Next slide. Particularly because of the geology in Massachusetts, areas for marshes to migrate landward are pretty limited. Next slide. So I'm going to be talking to you today about a number of efforts the CZM has done to support our programmatic mission in wetlands, and specifically to look more closely at salt marsh resiliency. Next slide. So first I'm going to talk about statewide condition assessment, and we've used a number of tools to get at marsh condition, both to build a data set and also to support our Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection in their charge to report on wetland condition as part of the Clean Water Act. Next slide, please. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read everything on this slide, but I want to make the point that most of these tools are looking at the biology of the marsh, the vegetation, invertebrates, sometimes birds and fish, features within the marsh, and also the surrounding land use to create a score, which is then compared to a reference condition, or in some models with a landscape level model. Next slide. So we've covered a lot of ground collecting this type of data in Massachusetts. This map is just one example of the data we have collected. We've built a really robust data set, but I will say that this data can be very logistically challenging to collect, requires a high level of staff time, and also a lot of technical expertise. Also, some of the models we are trying to develop an index of biological integrity, which is looking at the number of species within the marsh and trying to compare one marsh to another. But because marshes tend to live in this very narrow fringe, particularly for the plants, the diversity is relatively low. So it is a challenge to create these type of metrics in salt marshes versus other habitats where we've had more success. Next slide, please. So meanwhile, there's been huge advances in geospatial and remote sensing techniques that can really allow us to get at some of these questions at a much bigger scale than we would be able to do on the ground. It doesn't replace the work that we need to do on the ground to understand the marsh, but it does help to target and prioritize where we need to do these detailed level assessments. And so some of these tools will allow us to identify elevation, tidal range, sometimes even vegetation characteristics, to really start answering questions on factors that related to salt marsh resiliency across the state. Next slide, please. So one of the metrics I'm going to talk about is the unvegetated to vegetated marsh ratio. We are working on this with Neil Ganju and his team out of the USGS Woods Hole Science Center. And this metric is applied by breaking the marsh up into units and looking at elevation and tidal range and the proportion of area that is vegetated versus unvegetated within each marsh unit. And though it sounds pretty simplistic, it's actually very highly correlated with net sediment budget, which, as I mentioned previously, is really an important factor in marsh resiliency to be able to maintain and accrete sediments with sea level rise. Here we're looking at a map with some pilot data that was applied for the Great Marsh area of Massachusetts. And I want to point you to areas below 0.1 seem to be better off than areas above 0.1. So the areas in blue are probably more resilient. The areas in yellow and orange are perhaps more vulnerable. And we will have this data applied at a very high resolution scale for the entire salt marshes of Massachusetts by the end of this year. Next slide, please. Another tool we have at our disposal is the sea level rise affecting marshes model. This again was applied to all coastal wetlands in Massachusetts. This also takes into various factors such as elevation, habitat classification, tidal range, accretion, and makes a prediction based on various sea level rise scenarios and time steps. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just go through a couple of examples. Here again are the marshes behind Salisbury Beach. And I want to point you to the bright green, which is our high marsh or our irregularly flooded marsh. Next slide, please. And we can see when we apply the SLAM model at our what we call intermediate high scenario for this model, which is 4.5 feet of sea level rise in 2070, we're seeing a wholesale change to low marsh in this area. Next slide, please. I will say for the Great Marsh area of the state, which is roughly from Salisbury down to Gloucester, we are able to run the model two ways. So the SLAM model for most of the state uses a static accretion rate, which is really mirroring the historic sea level rise. But in the Great Marsh, we had data on the ground that helped us inform a variable accretion rate using the marsh equilibrium model. And this variable accretion really takes into account that biological interaction between the plants and the sediments in terms of elevation and sea level rise. So when we're applying that variable accretion rate, we can see the story is a bit different here in Salisbury with 4.5 feet of sea level rise in 2070, where more high marsh is maintained. I will say that when we get past in the higher sea level rise scenarios, around 7.1 feet is our highest scenario for this model here in 2100, the models do converge to a change over to low marsh because there will be a point where the plants just biologically cannot keep up with sea level rise inundation. Next slide, please. So here's another area in the state. This is the area behind Horseneck Beach Reservation in Westport, Mass. It's at a much lower tidal range. It's about 3, maybe 4 feet for this marsh versus maybe 10 to 11 feet up in Salisbury, so very different conditions. We can see here a lot of high marsh being depicted, although I do know this marsh is sort of in transition and there's a lot more low marsh that's being shown here. Next slide, please. So when we look at the SLAM model results applied here, it's indicating a wholesale change to a mudflat, essentially, for this marsh in 2070 with 4.5 feet of sea level rise. So it just points to the fact that depending on where you are in Massachusetts, the response to the marsh to sea level rise might be very different. And again, this is using that static accretion rate because we didn't have the data to support a MEM model application for all of the state. I will say that models are predictions based on assumptions, and I highly encourage you to visit the viewer to interact with the data, but also to learn more about how we applied the model and how to interpret the results. Next slide, please. We're also using this data to look at potential marsh migration areas. I know others in this series of talks will also be talking about this as well. And as I mentioned before, we have a pretty limited area where marshes can migrate inland here in Massachusetts. So it's imperative that we identify these corridors and we protect them from a land preservation perspective. Marshes can also migrate into other wetland types as well. Next slide, please. So we also have established a long-term monitoring program on the ground to look at changes through time. And this is really based on work out on the West Coast that was looking specifically at the marsh platform to upland ecotone and changes through time, and also modeled on approaches that have been applied from our National Estuarine Research Reserves. Next slide, please. So at each of these locations, we've established permanent transects where we are measuring vegetation both on the marsh platform and into the upland. And we're also taking elevation and hydrology measurements. Next slide, please. This is just an overview of our Essex site. We can see our permanent transects here and our water level logger. And we hope to return to these sites every 3 to 5 years to really start building this trends analysis to compare how the vegetation community within the transects may be changing through time. Next slide, please. And here is just an overlay of the potential marsh migration potential at this location. Again, we're hoping to see some of these changes into the upland. Next slide. So I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about our stakeholder and collaborative work, because we certainly need a lot of boots on the ground to tackle these issues of climate change. Next slide. So one of the efforts I'm involved in is the Massachusetts Ecosystem Climate Adaptation Salt Marsh Work Group, which I co-lead with my colleague Katie Call out of UMass Amherst. Here we have a group of practitioners that meet regularly to coordinate, to talk through ideas, share best practices to assess and monitor salt marshes, and talk about salt marsh resiliency. We recently are undergoing an important work based on a consensus approach to identify priority research gaps and needs within the next 1 to 5 years on specific topics such as hydrology, sea level rise, marsh migration, sediments, and nutrients. We hope to not only identify these needs, but also to start developing collaborative projects to really get at these big picture questions that we need to have a better understanding of for salt marsh resiliency. Next slide, please. We've also worked within our agency and our sister agencies within the state to interview staff to really understand how their work in salt marshes has been impacted by climate change and how they're considering that. And we're using the results of this work to inform our technical assistance both within our agency and also for outside. Next slide, please. So there's a lot more work to do and more I couldn't cover as part of this talk, but we will continue to start building our suite of geospatial tools. We are in talk to do some really detailed habitat mapping at our sentinel sites with the aim for a statewide approach. We are looking closely at restoration strategies and adaptation techniques, which I know will be a focus of some of the other talks here, and really trying to prioritize locations where we can identify which marshes are vulnerable and which marshes are more resilient across the state. Next slide. I just want to acknowledge my whole CZM team and all the other great people that we've been working with across the state and beyond to look at these issues of salt marsh resiliency. Next slide. And with that, I will take any questions if we have time.
Yes, we do. We have, one question in the chat. Thanks so much, Adrienne, for that presentation. So when you were talking about the SLAM modeling, they were asking if these data products would be available to download.
Yeah, so the SLAM, it depends. So the SLAM model results is all available in a viewer. So I would just Google Mass CZM SLAM viewer. That's how I get to it. Sometimes the state, the website can be a little arcane to get to. If you're looking for specific locations, connect with me offline, and we can see how we can get the data to you.
And then we do have time for one more, and a question saying that concerned about the images shown at Horseneck Marshes in Westport. Is there an example of a marsh that is not prioritized because of the scenario shown?
Well, we haven't, I should say we haven't got to the point of prioritizations, and this is just one tool in our toolbox. You know, Westport is I probably showed the two extremes in the state. We have Salisbury with a very high tidal range. A higher tidal range means the marsh is already at a higher elevation, has a lot of peat there, has a lot, you know, of capital. So as sea levels rise, it's already in a higher position in the landscape. Westport is sitting pretty low, and it also has a very low tidal range, so any increase in sea level rise is going to impact that area more. And so these are things that we're definitely considering within the state. How do we prioritize locations, and what factors are we considering?
Thank you. With that, we'll move on to our next presentation and speaker, who is myself. I'm Danielle Perry, and I work for Mass Audubon as its climate change adaptation ecologist. And today I'll be discussing how Mass Audubon is preparing for sea level rise and with climate vulnerability assessments of its coastal wildlife sanctuaries. So Mass Audubon went through a pilot study for climate vulnerability assessments, and we focused on 5 of our coastal wildlife sanctuaries to begin this process. So we looked at Joppa Flats in our North Shore in Newburyport, as along with Rough Meadows, Eastern Point, all in the North Shore. And then on the Cape, we started with our Barnstable Great Marsh in Barnstable and our Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary in Wellfleet. And kind of just to orient, as I mentioned before, so our 3 North Shore sites being Joppa, Rough Meadows, and Eastern Point, with our Barnstable and Wellfleet sites being on the Cape. And so for this presentation, for the sake of time, I'll just be focusing on the results from our Barnstable Great Marsh and Wellfleet Bay sanctuaries. But first, wanting to go through the different steps that we took for these vulnerability assessment framework. So for the first step, we were prioritizing the Mass Audubon assets. So each of our resources at the sanctuaries, we would have resource scoring meetings with sanctuary staff, Mass Audubon scientists, in order to determine how important that resource was and how valuable that resource was to carrying out Mass Audubon mission as well as the sanctuary mission. And the second part was looking at a sea level rise assessment using GIS and SLAM, sea level affecting marshes modeling that Adrienne talked about in the previous presentation, as well as some data from the NOAA sea level rise viewer. And for the final part of the assessment, we looked at salt marsh field surveys to get a better idea of how resilient our sanctuaries are currently and what are the current conditions of our salt marshes, because they are our first line of defense when it comes to sea level rise effects. So first, I'll just talk in more detail about the prioritization that each of our sanctuary resources. So we used a resource prioritization survey that each of our resources were then judged upon or scaled upon. And we use this survey based off of the trustee surveys that they use for their vulnerability assessments. And then we made some adjustments based off of Mass Audubon purposes and our specific needs. So for the categories, we looked at ecological importance, cultural and historic importance, recreational use, programming use, importance for financial and operational for that particular sanctuary. And this is just a closer look of what the survey would look like. So each resource, whether it be a natural resource or a man-made resource, would be scaled from 0 to 5 based off of these different criteria. And to provide some more examples, we would look at resources like our trail systems, our observation decks, our buildings, and of course, each of the natural habitats we would also score against that survey. And as a result, each resource would have a specific resource value score that would help us analyze how vulnerable that resource was and how we can prioritize our sites to then address climate issues that are impacting sanctuaries with our resources that are higher scaled. So the second part of the assessment was looking at a sea level rise assessment under different scenarios and expectations of sea level rise. So we looked at intermediate high sea level rise scenario for both 2030 and 2050. And so we would, using the SLAM modeling, so this is just an output, the photo that you can see from a Rough Meadows property in the North Shore, and using SLAM modeling, this would be an example of an output with each color representing a different natural community type. And the bright green that you see here is our high marsh area. And so we would then calculate the percent change in habitat over time from current times to 2030, as well as current times from 2050, and then see how that particular habitat was expected to change over time. And then we would calculate a habitat score by multiplying the percent change of that habitat by the resource value that was determined from the prioritization meetings. And then for our feature scores, we would then map each of our hard infrastructure at the sanctuaries, and then using SLAM being able to determine whether or not that resource was expected to be flooded during that time period of either 2030 or 2050. And then for the overall sanctuary, we would have an impact of sea level rise score, which is just the sum of the habitat scores and the feature scores. And I'll provide an example. So to give an example, if a salt marsh was expected to lose about 6.4% in 2030 from current times, then the resource value being 27, we would then multiply 27 by negative 0.064 to get a habitat score of negative 1.7. And then the same method for our tidal flats, we multiply 0.03 times 31 to get 0.9. And then for our infrastructure, this is just a road bordering one of our sanctuaries. It was expected to be irregularly flooded, so it loses about half of its resource value to be negative 14.5. But if it was expected to be regularly flooded, it would lose the full 29 points. So then for our impact of sea level rise score, we would just sum each one of those habitat scores for the salt marsh and our tidal flat, as well as the feature score to get an overall impact of sea level rise score for that particular sanctuary. And then so the more negative for value of the sea level rise score, then the more vulnerable it would be to sea level rise effects. And that value would help us prioritize our sanctuaries so that we are addressing the sanctuaries that are expected to be more vulnerable to sea level rise compared to others that are less vulnerable. And then our last piece was doing field surveys of the salt marsh of each of the sanctuaries. And we based this off of the Rhode Island rapid assessment method, then how they used to monitor and to look at current conditions of their salt marshes. So we kind of adapted this for our salt marshes at Mass Audubon within our sanctuaries. And so the first step of this was then determining the resilience score for each of the salt marshes. And we ranked this from very low to high. And this was just a measurement of disturbances on site and within the sanctuary. So we would look at disturbances like nutrient inputs, ponding and die-off areas, ditching within the marsh, as well as invasive species presence. And then so the higher the disturbance, the lower the resilience score. And so then we would do salt marsh condition surveys to get an idea of the current vegetation community types and also the condition of those community types. So through these surveys, we were able to determine whether the area was predominantly higher quality habitat or lower quality habitat, because if an area showed to have a lower quality habitat, we would know that that particular salt marsh would be more vulnerable to the progression of sea level rise and other climate change effects. And then the last part of the assessment was looking at the migration potential, because the natural response of salt marshes is to move landward and to move backwards. But as we know, with coastal development, this isn't always possible. And so some areas have higher migration potential than others. So then looking at the surrounding habitats to see if it's surrounded by natural areas or residential or urban areas. And then if the salt marsh does have space to move backwards, it will get a higher migration potential, but if it doesn't, it'll have a lower migration potential. And so areas that have lower migration potentials will then show to be less resilient to sea level rise, because there is no natural response of being able to move backwards unless those barriers are being removed. So now I'll go into the results and just focusing on Barnstable, Great Marsh, and Wellfleet Bay for today. So our Barnstable Great Marsh Sanctuary in Barnstable, Massachusetts. So it showed to have a resilience score of moderate, because some of the disturbances that we did see on site was high frequency of crab burrow density. There were areas of ponding and die-off depressions, as well as ditching, salt marsh ditching within the sanctuary as well. And so for the salt marsh conditions, some of the vulnerabilities that we noted was that the displacement of high marsh plants by low marsh plant species, which is a common response that we're seeing in our marshes with sea level rise, because high marsh plants aren't as flood tolerant as low marsh plant species. So now low marsh plant species are moving further up the marsh, removing some of that high marsh habitat, which is particularly of concern because certain species rely on high marsh habitat for survival, like our salt marsh sparrow. And there's also other vulnerabilities witnessed at the site of die-off and bear depressions. Some of the positives that we did see is that it does have extensive high marsh area and salt marsh shrubs on site. And for our impact of sea level rise score, if you look at the prioritization for 2030 and for 2050, based on the score, it showed to, out of the 5 pilot sites that we looked at, it showed to be the least vulnerable to sea level rise effects, and therefore the 5th on our prioritization list compared to the other 4 sites that we looked at. And this was because this site has a high migration potential. It is surrounded by natural communities, so the salt marsh does have space to move backwards, and so we're actually showing to gain habitat over time in both 2030 and 2050, because we are seeing migration occurring based off of the sea level rise analysis. And for our feature score, we're just seeing minor flooding. I think a bench was flooded in both in 2030 and 2050, but the rest of the infrastructure, because it was more upland, it was protected from sea level rise effects. So just some climate adaptation actions that we would have for this site, just to increase resilience, because it does seem to be in a healthy marsh as of right now, but in order to keep that true, we want to be able to enhance resilience of this marsh. So wanting to do some ditch remediation on site, and that is just naturally filling and selecting certain ditches to fill in order to prevent salt marsh subsidence or salt marsh shrinking, in order to promote salt marsh accretion. So next I'll talk about our Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. So the resilience score for this sanctuary showed to be bordering to low resilience and moderate resilience. So some of the disturbances that we are seeing within the salt marsh system is that high intensity of crab burrows, some nutrient input effects, as well as ponding and die-off depressions and evidence of soil disturbance currently on site. And when we look at the salt marsh condition, some of the vulnerabilities that we were seeing were bare sediment, some die-off depressions, but some positives that we did see where it had distinctive high and low marsh area. And then this site, based off of the impact of sea level rise score, was shown to be prioritized the first site out of the 5 pilot sites that we looked at and that needs action. And this is mostly because of the infrastructure that is very close to the coast, so vulnerable to flooding. Some of our trails, some of our buildings, due to their proximity to the coast, is showing to be flooded by 2030 and 2050. And then when we look at 2050 for our habitat score, we see that jump in the habitat score because one of our freshwater habitats was expected to transition into a saltwater habitat due to sea level rise impacts. So we're losing some freshwater habitat within that site. And the migration potential within the site was shown to be moderate because even though some areas are surrounded by natural communities, there is a slope. So when there's a slope surrounding the salt marsh, it acts as an additional barrier to prevent salt marsh migration. So salt marshes, they like a gentle incline in order to move more landward. So any steep slopes adds a further barrier for migration. So at this site, wanting to address some of the vulnerable trails that are expected to be subject to flooding within those timeframes, as well as creating a potential living shoreline at that site in order to mitigate some of that sea level rise impacts, to slow down wave action and help to prevent coastal erosion to further protect our marshes. And to just look at what these 2 sites compared to our other, our cumulative, our 5 sites that we looked at, as you can see in the dark blue is our Wellfleet Bay, and this is the impact of sea level rise score. So again, the more negative, the more vulnerable it means to sea level rise. And so you can see for both 2030 and 2050, the Wellfleet Bay showed to have higher vulnerability sea level rise, and Barnstable Great Marsh, which is in the stripe pattern, showed to be the least vulnerable to sea level rise compared to our other sites. So now I'll just talk a little bit more about what Mass Audubon is and even giving some examples of also what Rhode Island has done to combat some of these sea level rise effects. So right now, Mass Audubon is doing a runnel project or hydrological restoration project at our Allen's Pond Wildlife Sanctuary in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. And so runnels are basically shallow channels that are used to drain water impoundments that are resting on the high marsh area. So as an impact of sea level rise, what is occurring is that the salt marshes aren't draining as during low tide. So instead, water is staying on the salt marsh surface, which is dying off the vegetation. So we're starting to see more mud flat areas and bare areas expanding. So the purpose of these runnels is to drain those water impoundments in order to promote vegetation recolonization within these areas. And as you can see from the photos, this can be done with volunteers and using hand digging. And it can also be done using an excavator. So this is just a photo of what a salt marsh would look like previously before the runnels were created. And then runnels can be created by excavation. And this is after the runnels were created, how you can see the vegetation recolonizing and coming back. Another climate change adaptation strategy is ditch remediation. So as I mentioned before when speaking about the Barnstable Great Marsh project and one of the actions that we want to do, which is being able to use salt marsh hay, which is our high marsh plant, and using that material to fill selected ditches that can be used over time to start to recolonize the salt marsh peat, to promote salt marsh accretion. So we're encouraging salt marsh growth instead of salt marsh subsidence or salt marsh shrinking. So this has been done at a number of different sites within the North Shore. One site being in Newbury, Old Town Hill, Nelson's Island, and Raleigh in Massachusetts. And we're also exploring the use of this technique at our Mass Audubon Rough Meadows property in Raleigh, Massachusetts. And the next strategy, which has been done in Rhode Island, not yet in Massachusetts, is the sediment enhancement. So sediment enhancement is when taking dredged sediment and adding it to the salt marsh in order to raise its elevation, to give it more time with sea level rise. So it's allowing the salt marsh to gain more height so it becomes less vulnerable to the sea level rise rates. And so this is a very extensive process and has been done within Rhode Island at our Nanigrit Pond in Charlestown, Rhode Island, and Quaney Pond in Charlestown, Rhode Island as well. And with that, I will take any questions. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. So unless anybody has any questions, we can move on to our next presentation. So next we have Wenley Ferguson from Save the Bay, a habitat director, a restoration director at Save the Bay. And we also have Mike Bradley, who is a research associate at the University of Rhode Island. So first we'll have Wenley speak, and then Mike will speak after her.
Thanks, Danielle. And thanks all for tuning in this afternoon. It looks like we have a great diversity of attendees. I recognize some names, so it's nice to have this summit be both Rhode Island and Massachusetts. I believe it's the first year for the Land and Water Summit. I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing. Save the Bay's been doing salt marsh restoration work since the mid-90s, and a lot of our focus over the last decade has been adapting to accelerated sea level rise. So Danielle showed some of the in-marsh adaptation techniques. We've been using hydrologic modifications like runnels. We've been involved in those sediment placement projects in Rhode Island as well. There are actually 2 additional ones on U.S. Fish and Wildlife properties as well. So, but today we're going to talk about what's happening in the marsh migration corridor. And once you start to look, you can see salt marsh migration is occurring throughout our region. And next slide. I tried to just advance my slide. It didn't work, Danielle. And as Adrienne mentioned, there are many impediments to marsh migration. In our region, slope is one of them. Narragansett Bay was an old river valley. We have very little area that has the appropriate slope and condition for the marsh to migrate, even if there wasn't any development. And then we know we also have a lot of coastal development, and our marshes are literally up against infrastructure. This is a moon tide on the right, down in westerly Rhode Island. This happens every single moon tide. That's where the marsh wants to go, is into the road. The picture of the water main cap, that's solidago, which is seaside goldenrod growing in a roadway. So it shows that's, again, it's tidally influenced. It's where the marsh wants to be, but there's a road in the way. And we, even with sea level rise and all the information about it, there's still pressure to develop these low-lying lots. That lot is dominated by high marsh vegetation, so you can get an idea of how low it is. Next slide. As I mentioned, we are witnessing the effects of sea level rise and how our marshes, if they do have space, are migrating inland. This time of year is a great time to go out, look for signs of early greening of the marsh grasses. That's a type of plant called blackgrass or Juncus gerardi. And here you can see the Juncus is growing inland of a cedar tree. So that marsh grass is moving inland of upland vegetation. We're seeing beginning die off, and it's hard to see the bottom picture at Allen's Pond in Dartmouth. We're also seeing that that's a cedar tree that has uprooted this winter. And because of their shallow roots, the upland vegetation, like cedars, are very vulnerable because they don't have a deep root system, and because of the salinity. And we're seeing more and more loss of our remaining cedar trees because they are succumbing to the wind as well, as these sites, as they become more stressed. Next slide. So we've been doing variety of marsh migration facilitation projects, and this is just a Google map that I created. And most recently, as Danielle mentioned, we've been working over in Massachusetts as well, over at Allen's Pond in Dartmouth with the Dartmouth Natural Resource Trust, as well as Audubon. Next slide. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is some of those migration strategies, as well as ways that we were identifying sites in a much simpler way than what Danielle was providing, their vulnerability assessment. But we have been, over the last, I'd say 8 to 10 years, been using tools like the initial run of SLAM in 2015 in Rhode Island, as well as king tides and storm tides to document where marshes will migrate with sea level rise. Next slide. So just to begin, this is, as I mentioned, our first very low-tech approach, and Massachusetts and Rhode Island both participate in a program called MyCoast. If you haven't downloaded the MyCoast app, please do so. It's a great way to document flooding conditions in coastal areas. This is a coastal area that floods regularly. It's an old ball field where the marsh is literally migrating inland. And prior to the SLAM maps, that's what we use to identify, not only just where the vegetation's moving inland, but those larger king tides. That's a good indication of where the marsh is going to migrate with a foot of sea level rise, your average king tide. Next slide. As I mentioned, we also use SLAM maps. This is the first run of SLAM in Rhode Island. This is that same site. And sorry, I didn't zoom in. I wanted you to see this whole image. In Rhode Island, the way the SLAM was run, we looked at 1, 3, and 5 feet of sea level rise back in 2015. And the brownish area is where the marsh will migrate with 1 foot. And those king tide photos and that marsh migration, that 1 foot of marsh migration, is really spot on with regards to where we're seeing coastal flooding during those king tides that are just about 1 foot above mean high or high water. Next slide. So getting into next slide, Danielle, please. I don't know if it's freezing.
Sorry, it's freezing on me.
Uh-oh. Well, what I was going to say, what the next slide is, as Danielle's hopefully figuring it out, and not to try to figure out the technical issue. There is a technical person here from TerraCore, I believe I saw in the chat. Maybe
I'm gonna refresh, so your slides might go away for a second, but I'll join right back.
Sure. So what I'm going to talk about next are the various adaptation techniques. And one of the first things that we have done is looking at infrastructure removal and practices that could be changed to allow better conditions for marsh migration. As we saw, there's roads, there's all sorts of infrastructure in the way. And we've been working with partners from land trusts to state land, federal land as well, trying to figure out if there is low-lying infrastructure, can it be moved inland? And so it would allow for that marsh to have a free and clear migration corridor. One of the first projects we did back in '99 was in a state park, where we both moved a bike path inland as well as moved the mow line further inland. A lot of these properties, you'll find that the marsh is still being mowed, and that's something, both on public land as well as private land. And that's a simple technique that can improve the current health of the marsh, the high marsh habitat, as well as create a better for the marsh to migrate into in the future.
Wenley, do you want to go ahead and share? I'm afraid if I leave that the broadcast will end.
Okay.
So you can go try sharing your screen.
Unfortunately, guess what? Did anyone else have it up? Do you have it up, Mike?
I don't have it up, but you want me to try and share?
Sure, because I just don't have mine open right now.
Yeah, Danielle, you're going to have to stop sharing though.
Oh gosh.
Actually, I do have mine open, Mike, if that...
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Let me just see if this will work.
I couldn't see share as a file anyway.
Okay, I logged out.
Okay, share screen. Let's see if this is going to work. It worked when we did the trial the other day. Let's see, sorry. It is... Are you sure? It's not allowing me to share.
I can try sharing mine again. Sorry, everyone. Technical difficulties.
Yeah. Let me. Are you gonna? You are trying to share yours again?
Mm-hmm. Might take a second to load.
So another technique as that simple moving a mow line inland, you can imagine it takes a lot of baby steps to get people to agree to change that where they mow. And we have been doing some work with a local, a town that has literally been mowing the low marsh, so not just the high marsh, and been over about a 5-year period. We've moved the mow line inland 3 different times. And, you know, my first thought was, well, is this enough? And this is the site that I was referring to. And if you go a little further north, you could actually see Spartina alterniflora, the low marsh grass being mowed. And actually, if you just want to go to the slide before, if we don't jinx ourselves, this was the site that we did back in 99 or 2000 where we actually moved a bike path out of the marsh migration corridor. You can see the ruts in the grass. That grass is high marsh, and we got the state to stop mowing the marsh. And a simple project got a little funding to move the bike path. Next slide. So this is the preconditions before we stopped mowing the marsh. And it's amazing to see. Next slide. You could just, there's my son on a sick day. And all the grass he's walking on is juncus. You could still see that straight line, but we've slowly moved that mow line further inland. Next slide. Just in one growing season, the marsh vegetation really did return. And the next slide, we're now working with the town land trust. They developed, with my input, a marsh migration corridor plan for this site, and they've stopped mowing in multiple areas, some of the upland areas that are suitable for marsh migration. Next slide. That same site that I just showed you, that we had some moontide flooding of, working with this neighborhood association. This site, this is one of these die-off zones that Danielle was mentioning. This low-lying, what had been a field, a ball field, a recreational area for the neighborhood, is now converting into marsh grass. And I believe I have another slide. I might have shown it before, there's actually a metal backstop for the ball field that we just got funding to remove. And again, it takes a certain amount of time to get the community to support the fact that you can't get this land, you're not going to return it to a ball field. It's flooding more frequently. And they are now embracing the fact that this is a marsh migration corridor and are going to do public signage about why they're moving the mow line inland, and really use it as an educational tool. Next slide. This is another project we worked on with the state of Rhode Island. The Department of Environmental Management owns this land. It had been the low-lying field behind this barrier spit, had been in agriculture, and they ended up changing the agricultural activity, planting that area, that field. You can see the bottom right photo in warm season grasses, and moving a vulnerable parking lot to the west further inland. So we're now, cars no longer can drive out on the beach spit. They can park right along the existing road. They moved the parking lot. So it was a multi-pronged approach to really improve the marsh migration abilities here and restore the cobble beach itself. Next slide. Across the street from that site is another low-lying field that we actually found an impediment to migration, which is an old stone berm. It wasn't a stone wall, it was just a pile of stones that the farmers over the years dumped along the edge, and invasive species grew on it, and it acted as just enough of an impediment for that, both holding groundwater along the upland edge and preventing the salt water in. So we were digging some runnels in the marsh platform itself, and we extended those into the low-lying field where the marsh is beginning to migrate, and removed those stone berms. Next slide. And I'm just going to zip through these. Another project, we've gotten some low-lying roads closed. This is a road that floods regularly. Next slide. And there were some lots that could have been developed along it. And by over the last 5 years, we've seen the road literally colonized with salt marsh vegetation. Next slide. We've done projects. This is a large dam removal project we're doing on the Kickamuit River, where this was a tidal estuary historically, and we're proposing to remove both the lower and the upper dam. That it used to be a drinking water supply up until about 10 years ago. They used this as a drinking water supply, and that's salt water coming into the drinking water supply during a king tide. So we are now coming up with a dam removal plan to restore what had been a tidal estuary in this river system. Next slide. And this shows some of the marsh migration opportunities once those dams are removed. There are 2 dams we're looking at, and the poor water quality conditions of the impoundments today. Next slide. Another project that we've been doing region-wide are what we call end-of-road retrofits, where we are actually removing low-lying infrastructure like a road that dead ends along the shore. They're publicly owned. This road flooded regularly. The road extended into a brackish marsh, actually. And by removing the asphalt, we also provide some area for stormwater management where the new road ends. And it provides area for marsh migration. Next slide. Another project that we're doing, another technique, is regrading the banks where there is space for migration, but there might be a slight elevation change. This was an old agricultural area where the former farmer had dumped rubble, oysters, a lot of debris. I found old pottery. This is cement slab. And it's enough of a impediment that we're going to remove this material, grade the bank back, and plant it with native grasses and shrubs. Next slide. And the last technique is land protection, which is a huge and heavy lift. But with the SLAM maps, we have been doing outreach to property owners in areas where we've identified room for marsh migration. This is on the Palmer River, close to the state line. And just recently, we secured our first easement on a low-lying parcel of that center dot. Next slide. And it was through the Wetland Reserve Easement Program through Natural Resource Conservation Service. And the great thing is, once the easement was secured, the property owner, since we've been working with the Warren Land Conservation Trust during this entire period of time with NRCS, they received a donation of the land from the property owner, and now we have NRCS dollars to do a restoration, implement a restoration plan, which is going to include, that's the bottom photo, it's going to include both some in-marsh work, addressing some of the impounded water on the marsh, as well as planting what had been a hay field with a combination of worm seeds and grasses, pollinators, and some wetland vegetation, as well as managing invasives. Next slide. And like all of the work that we've discussed today, it requires partnerships, and land trusts and municipalities are probably the partners I work with the most. And the wonderful thing about working with the land trust community is you have the built-in stewardship that's needed for these projects to be maintained and look at future migrations. So thank you. And I think we probably should go right to Mike to make sure he has enough time.
Yes, thanks, Wenley. Go take it away, Mike.
Thanks, everyone. It's really great to be here with all these great presenters this afternoon. My name is Mike Bradley. I'm a research associate in at the University of Rhode Island Environmental Data Center, and I'm going to be talking about a project that we have been doing for some time now with some great partners at Save the Bay and the Rhode Island Land Trust and CRMC, and also at the Narragansett Bay Estuarine Research Reserve. The project, next slide. Project basically is to try and build and expand upon the great work that Wenley and Save the Bay have done over the years. She mentioned some of the land preservation activities that she has done with Warren on the Palmer River. And so what occurred to us is that it would be great to try and build a tool and to try and build a statewide assessment to scale up those types of activities to the whole state of Rhode Island and to include the 21 coastal towns in Rhode Island. So as part of the 2015 SLAM run, they had some, really prescient, I thought, recommendations. Start focusing on some of these marsh migration corridors. Again, the primary method to identify these corridors for everyone here on this panel is to use something called the SLAM model, which is a spatially explicit ecological model that uses a variety of inputs. And I don't have time to go into some of those details, but suffice it to say that through this project, we wanted to update the CRMC 2015 SLAM modeling that was done using some newer projections of sea level rise and also some newer inputs from GIS in terms of elevation and salt marsh habitat maps. So the goals of this project were this. We wanted to focus on the parcel as the unit of conservation. Land preservation is all about the parcel, right? So we wanted to focus on the parcel as the unit of preservation and to build our tool around the parcel. And luckily, we could leverage another project that we had at the EDC where a statewide database of all of our coastal parcels were at the ready for me to use. I mentioned that we wanted to rerun SLAM with updated data. And then we wanted to develop statewide parcel databases that incorporate SLAM outputs as well as other metrics that can be used to make conservation decisions. And we wanted to identify those conservation opportunities based on this database. So the idea here is that this is a tool that can be used proactively. I serve on the North Kingstown Land Trust, and quite often our preservation activities are, quite frankly, ad hoc. Phone rings, our land preservation person says, "Yeah, that sounds great. Let's pursue this." So this tool on this project is an effort to try and be a little bit more proactive about our activities. Now, granted, there is enough work just based on the ad hoc opportunities, to be quite frank. Her phone is ringing, plenty. But the idea here is to develop a plan. But the other way to approach this is that this tool then also provides the land trusts with an unbiased way to assess and identify these conservation opportunities, right? And that's pretty key. We want to be as unbiased about some of these opportunities as we can. And so I'm pleased to announce that today I'm going to be unveiling this tool for the first time at this conference. And but first, let me talk about a little bit about the background. Again, the goal was to have some outreach with the land trusts so that they can begin to use this tool in their activities. Next slide, please, Danielle. Okay, so how do we go about developing this parcel database? We have two parcel databases based on potential salt marsh habitat. We ran the SLAM model two different ways with using the NOAA 2017 high projection, and at that sea level rise curve, that corresponds to a 2.8-foot sea level rise for the year 2050, and an 8.8 amount of sea level rise for the year 2100. So we took those outputs and that extent of that potential salt marsh habitat. Now, I do want to mention that when we ran the SLAM runs, there's a number of ways to run the SLAM model, but we wanted to cast as wide a net as we possibly could when we identified these marsh migration corridors. So we ran the model with the expectation that it's going to create salt marsh habitat even on developed land. Okay, and that's kind of an important consideration. So we didn't mask any of this potential salt marsh habitat. Some other inputs and other data sets that we used to create some metrics on a per parcel basis was the amount of impervious surface, whether or not that parcel had a structure on it, and critically and importantly, I think, whether or not that parcel is adjacent to already previously existing conserved land. And that comes from the statewide RIGIS database. So again, to date, we've developed these parcel databases. We're lucky here in Rhode Island. We only have 20 coastal towns, unlike Massachusetts, which has way more than 20. But we've developed these parcel databases for all 20 coastal towns. Next slide, please, Danielle. Okay, so the first sort of fun GIS analysis that we can do with these parcel databases is just to do a straight intersect and a straight database query about how many parcels we think are going to be affected for each one of these sea level rise outputs. And so for the town of Warren, if we just count the number of parcels that could be affected with potential salt marsh habitat at the year 2050 and at the year 2100, we get a number of 327 potential parcels. And at 2100, that number balloons to almost 1,000 parcels. It was my feeling that while this is important information, in order to identify sort of very important high priority conservation opportunities, we wanted to pare down that number so that we didn't just unload 1,000, potentially 1,500 potential parcels for conservation. That would just be too much of a number. It certainly would overwhelm my little land trust. And so I just didn't think that would be very helpful. So I needed a way to identify more higher priority conservation parcels. And so we had some meetings with the town of Warren and the Warren Land Trust. I also had some meetings with Rhode Island NRCS to discuss their agricultural conservation easement program, and I got some ideas about what they use to identify parcels that they undertake for their conservation opportunities. And so, next slide, please, Danielle. And so this is what I came up with. And what I'm calling a Tier 1 conservation opportunity. These are parcels, and I think what's important here is that this is not an arbitrary list here. I mean, some of this is art, but I wanted to base some of this on science as well. And so I can defend each one of these 5 metrics that I used to query the parcel databases. That first one is loosely based on the wetland reserve easement program that Wenley referred to. In that score sheet, they say that parcels that have a higher, have at least half an acre of salt marsh are scored higher. Okay. The second one is a no-brainer. We need some amount of potential salt marsh habitat on the parcel. And when you run the SLAM model, you get a lot of, especially at the resolution that we ran it, you know, you get a lot of small sliver areas. So I wanted to include areas that were greater than 5%, but less than 75% of the total area of the parcel. So you have some salt marsh, but the parcel also has some room to migrate at a future date. The next one again comes directly from the discussions that I had with Rhode Island and RCS. They say that size doesn't matter, but when you read their score sheet, it actually does matter. And you know, parcels that are adjacent to existing conserved land score higher because you know, it's more bang for their buck essentially. And RCS is a soil-based organization. It's one that focuses on farmers, and so they also weight very strongly whether or not the area has prime farmland or statewide important soils. And so I added that as another database metric. So Tier 1 parcels have, on a per area basis, greater than half of the parcel containing prime farmland or statewide important soils. Impervious surface is critical because you know, in the discussion that we've had this afternoon, we've seen that impervious surface is an impediment to salt marsh establishment. And so we want to identify parcels that do not have a lot of impervious surface. That's going to be the highest potential for a migration corridor. Okay, so if we go to the town of Tiverton then, the areas in pink, okay, signify parcels that meet all 5 of these criteria. Okay, and what I'm calling Tier 1 conservation opportunities. Now, I called them Tier 1 because there's going to be another step here, I hope, where there'll be interest at the land trust level to start to go through each of these opportunities and say, yep, this looks good. Yep, this one, we should definitely spend some time on the ground checking this out. Yes, we should send this person a letter to see if they are interested in pursuing some sort of conservation. I know as well, I realize that some of this stuff I can't get at. The number one thing about getting someone to undertake a conservation project is landowner willingness. Well, I can't get at that through GIS, but I can get through some of these other things. Next slide there, please, Danielle. 5 minutes. Okay. So I summed all the Tier 1 conservation parcels for every coastal town. And we see that at 2050, the town of Tiverton has the most opportunities. If there are any people here from Providence, Middletown, Cranston, or Newport, this might not be the workshop for you because I didn't find any Tier 1 opportunities there. The news gets a little bit better for those towns at 2100. Tiverton still tops the list at 42 parcels. North Kingstown comes in at second, and Block Island comes in third. I did want to spend some time showing I'm hoping that the next question people are asking me is, this is great, Mike. Where can I start to see our Tier 1 conservation opportunities? And so maybe I'll just spend just a minute, we don't have a lot of time, showing you, next slide, where you can start to look at some of these parcels with the SLAM outputs. I'm calling the tool the Salt Marsh Coastal Parcel Planning Tool, and you can find it on our website, www.edc.uri.edu on the projects page. I really want to encourage everyone that's listening to send me questions or suggestions about you know, what I've talked about today. And do I have a minute, Danielle, or should I just stop there? I wanted to try and show people where.
Yep, you have a minute.
Okay.
Do you need to share?
I'll just do a minute here. Yeah. You need to stop sharing. Did you stop? There we go. Okay. Are you seeing me now? Are you seeing this now? No?
I don't see your screen.
Share screen. Oh, it says I'm sharing. Can you not see it?
No. Are you sharing a file or?
It says you are sharing your entire screen. I can stop and try again.
Okay.
Share screen. Doesn't seem to be sharing.
Okay.
Well,
We'll see if Mike can, if Mike is able to share within the next couple of minutes, and we can take some questions in the meantime. I did see a question from earlier about the climate adaptation strategies that were being completed and their impact on invasive species. So I think the runnel implementation that I discussed earlier and Wenley discussed as well, that has a mechanism of being able to. Okay, so Josh is recommending, Mike, that you're sharing a file and not the whole screen. The tech person.
I want to share the website though.
Oh.
It worked before. I was doing it before. Anyway, we're almost out of time. Please visit the Salt Marsh Coastal Parcel Planning Tool if you're interested.
Great. And then just to answer that question about the runnel implementation and how that can be helped to manage invasive species. So where Phragmites australis is present within salt marshes, you often see a lot of standing water because they like that type of environment. So with the use of runnels, we can actually drain that standing water, which can help to the Phragmites populations to die back. And Wenley, if you have anything else to add on that point too.
I think another, so yes, hydrologic modifications can lower the water table and drain some of that impounded fresh water off that migration corridor area and reduce at least the height and vigor of Phragmites. It's not going to remove it all. But the other thing is some of those historic features like those old and those piles of stone, old berms, that disturbance area often has a lot of invasives. So invasive management along with marsh migration facilitation, I think, is one of the techniques that we're looking at, trying to remove some of the dense honeysuckle or multiflora rose that's in that migration corridor and preventing migration. They're doing that over at the Ocean View property on Allen's Pond, the Dartmouth Land Trust, and in coordination with Mass Audubon. So first step, remove invasives. Next step, try to replant some of the salt tolerant species that can grow in that marsh migration corridor.
Thanks, Wenley. So I think that's all the time we have for today. Thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.